Alrighty. So, by the way, a few of you did not do the makeup assignment for the snow day. You've got to do that. I said before class starts, about 6 of you didn't turn it in. I'll give you a little leeway on this one. I need it by noon today, right? Otherwise, I'm just going to count you absent for that day. It'll go under an unexcused absence. But you got your email. So if you didn't get the email, that means you're probably not checking your Marymount email. I've had students say, I never check my Marymount email. Well, I'm sorry. That's the way I'm going to communicate with you, right? So make sure that you do that and make sure that you do the things that are assigned and keep on top of stuff. So some people haven't done that yet, and this is going to hit you like a tsunami, right? A wave of stuff because you don't know what we're talking about. But those who do know what we're talking about, and that was the whole point of doing that. That was not my decision, by the way. I would have just as soon taken a day off as well, right? But the higher administration, accreditation agency, they want us to make sure that we've got stuff for days that are missed because it's contact hours are the basis of our accreditation, right? And that's what you're paying for. Okay, so that said, for those of you that did not play back the recording from Monday and do that really brief worksheet for Monday, email that to me. You need to do that, right? So what we talked about in that recording was the fact that in art history, our major focus of study is we look at subject matter, or what art historians call iconography, and try to describe what we're seeing, what is depicted within the image. We also discuss how it appears, not what appears, but how it appears, what we call style, the style of the piece, right? Both of these are the same subject matter, the Virgin Mary with her baby son Jesus on her lap, on her heavenly throne, right? That's all the same in both of them, and with actually secondary angels as well, right? That much is shared. Even the poses are kind of shared. But the style are how the artist goes about illustrating this. And our anonymous artist on the right, whose name we don't know because the work isn't signed, the style is significantly more flat. The sense of perspective is a little off, right? There's no great sense of depth. In fact, if we look at the arms of the chair, you'll notice that, you know how you stand on railroad tracks and things come together, right? And long, straight highways. The arms of her chair ought to do that. But they don't. They go apart. That sort of flattens out the image. And if you look at how the artist handles the drapery, the folds of the drapery, it's either the blue of the pigment or the gold of the highlight and nothing in between, right? And sometimes those lines give you the sense of where her knees are supposed to be, but sometimes it's just kind of decorative pattern, right? It's either A or B. It's like a duotone print, right? And that also tends to flatten it out, right? As does the gold background. The only parts that have any sense of three-dimensional modeling is the flesh, right? The face of Jesus, the face of Mary, their hands. Now we get to Giotto, right? Less than 50 years later, and there's a significantly greater sense of depth. Like the throne really seems to occupy space and envelop around her and come out, the stairs come out toward us, right? And if we look at the bodies of the Virgin and Child, we can see that they're actually a gradation from light to dark, right? That the style has moved toward greater realism in Giotto's work, right? To the point where, you know, some of these characters are even looking in from the sides, right? But all of them have a sense of palpable three-dimensionality that becomes even more apparent when you compare it to the earlier work of the This is style, right? The how rather than the what. The choices an artist makes. And one of the things we try to determine is why they make these choices, right? Those choices can also be the subject matter. Why did they do the Madonna and Child on the throne? Why did they choose that subject matter? These kind of choices are usually determined by the historical context from which the piece came. So unlike an art appreciation class, an art history class tries to analyze these things as someone from the 14th century, the 1300s, or the 13th century, the 1200s, how they might have understood them, right? Now, the problem is we don't have people who sat down and said, I looked at a work of art and this is what I saw. This is what I thought. We have to try to figure out by connecting it to other parts of that culture. So we can look at, for example, religious practices and say, what did they say about imagery? We can look at poetry. We can look simply at the Bible. We can look at the tradition of images. And all of these things can give us information that help to then explain the things that we're seeing within that historical context. That's our analysis. So what we do is we take a description of the object and we use it to move toward an analysis of that object. Right? And that analysis is then historically grounded. Right? Now, this change in style that we're seeing is owed to quite a few different external forces. Giotto's choice to make it more three-dimensional. And that was what was discussed on the Monday lecture. We talked about the rise of the mendicant orders and the way in which those preachers in the cities made biblical stories more realistic. And we talked about the rise of a new kind of government and social order in Florence, where Giotto's working, and how this merchant class, people who make their own lot in life, have different priorities than, for example, kings and churches and whatnot. Right? And these things have every effect on Giotto, seem to have an almost direct effect on Giotto's and other artists' interest in moving toward a greater three-dimensionality. The third thing is the Renaissance, right? This rebirth of an interest in ancient Roman art. Right? And in the art of ancient Rome, as we discussed on Monday's recording, we see this same modeling in three dimensions that we have here. Right? So those things are lying behind Giotto's choice to break away from the tradition, which came out of Byzantine icons, to something that's much more kind of realistic. Now, it's not entirely realistic, but it's more realistic, right? There's still something kind of artificial about the head structures, very low forehead, very long jowls, kind of boxy looking, typical for Giotto's style. But it's significantly more realistic than what had been coming in the generation before him. And in fact, there was an art historian there for the history of the Renaissance, right? One of our primary sources should be on the screen, but it's not. Is the guy in 1568, Giorgio Vasari, was a painter in Florence, same city Giotto's from, about 260 years later. And he was a pupil of Michelangelo, right? And he decided it was high time to sort of account for what's really going on in the Renaissance and how great and cool it is, right? So he writes this book, multiple volumes, right? History of the greatest painters, sculptors, and architects of the Renaissance, right? The lives of the painters. I think it's called The Lives of the Most Eminent, right? Painters, sculptors, and architects. And he gives us biographical information on everything, right? So we've got a lot of information about Giotto because he lived there and he was able to go find out where Giotto's paintings were in the different churches and all that, right? And what Vasari tells us as he traces it, he gives us this sort of story of the Renaissance that starts and ends chronologically, right? So there's the first generation, Giotto, moving on to a second generation, and the third generation, which is Michelangelo, which he says is the best, and this is where it's all leading, which for Vasari makes sense because he's a teacher, right? So in other words, he kept saying, like, I'm the best, right? And what Vasari tells us is that Giotto is the first light of the Renaissance. Right? He traces back and he sees exactly what happened with Michelangelo's teacher, what's happening 250 years later. He sees this as the start. Right? And this is how we, to this day, 400 years later, 450 years later, we still present it. Right? This is the beginning of the Renaissance. Right? Because there is a rather drastic change in an approach to picture making from what was happening in Italy in the generation prior to Giotto. Now we've got a Giotto downtown. We talked about, there it is. So this is, I'm ahead of myself. We've got a Giotto downtown, one of the best ones in America. The Met has one in New York. I think that's about it for Giotto in America, right? There aren't that many. And we talked about the symbolism of this piece and the online work, and we talked about the impact on the Renaissance, on Giotto's realism. merchant class versus feudalism, as already mentioned, the mendicant orders as well, right? And we also talked about the fact that he's working in the city of Florence, where not only is there a very, very strong Franciscan presence, one of the mendicant orders, but also is one of these cities that has broken free from the feudal system, right? Under the feudal system, if you're a laborer, you stay a laborer, right? You're a peasant. But if you're nobility, you stay nobility. And the only real mobility in society, it's like for Americans, it's hard to grasp, right? We're going to college because we want a better job, right? We want to get a better pay when we leave. And we want to sort of be better than we started. Right? But through the Middle Ages, that wasn't the case. It didn't matter how hard you worked as a peasant, how good you were at your job, you stayed a peasant. And the only real mobility was moving into the clergy, becoming a monk. And even peasants didn't have the option to do that as much as people from the nobility did. Right? So society was much more frozen. However, beginning in the 1100s in Florence, with the rise of intercity trade, international trade, the rise of modern capitalism, we start to see a breakdown of the feudal structure. And Florence is actually governed kind of as a democracy. It's not really as an oligarchy, but still, right? Only the wealthiest people could become part of it. But in order to be part of government, you had to be a tradesman. You had to actually belong to one of the guilds, right? Like a labor union. Right? And those then elected the people that ran the city. So the city was run by its merchant class, right? By its craftsman class. And this is a new structure of society that Giotto is part of, right? And has everything to do with the rise of the Renaissance. So he's working in Florence. Okay? So this is all kind of a recap of what we covered on Monday. Right? 5-minute recap of a 40-minute screencast. Now, Giotto is not the only artist who is working in a more realistic style, right? And Florence is not the only city that is this sort of more modern social structure. Another city right next door, right? The city of Siena also has a merchant system of government, a quasi-democracy, free from the feudal system, also has the presence of the mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And we see artists there at the same time as Giotto moving toward a more realistic style. Right? And this is arguably the best Duccio anywhere in America. It's certainly one of the most important works by Duccio in America. Right? It's actually originally part of a bigger work. And this is something to keep in mind as we're looking at pictures in a museum, or from a museum, is that many of the pictures that we see before were not made to go in museums, right? These days, when artists produce works of art, they produce them to be sold by a gallery to a potential buyer, and hopefully that buyer is important enough that you get a work in a museum somewhere. Right? But in Giotto and Duccio's times, works of art were commissioned. That means they were paid for up front. They didn't make works of art on spec, right? They didn't make works of art hoping somebody's going to come in and buy it. Right? There may have been a few they keep around just in case, but the vast majority of the works, and most of the things you'll see in museums, are things that were made and paid for up front, right? And that means when we have contracts that survive, one of the things that we see is that the patron, right, the person who commissions the work, has very specific requests for what the artist is supposed to do. So when we talk about artistic choices, sometimes those choices are not the artist's, right? Sometimes those choices are placed on the artist. And we don't have surviving contracts for every single work of art, but when we do, right, and we have a contract for this one, they tell us some really interesting stuff about what they're expecting from the work, right? So Duccio's work here, it's a nativity scene. So this is the birth of Christ, right? That's what nativity means. And one of the OERs is the life of Christ in art and the terms we use for the different scenes. And for the first, 5 weeks of class, a lot of religious art. That's the art that was out there, right? Religious art and portraiture. So it'll take us a while to get the secular subject matter. non-Christian subject matter in Europe. The Nativity is the birth of Christ. So there's Jesus on the manger there. And we'll come back to talking about the subject matter of the Virgin Mary. Right? And this work was separated from a larger work that was commissioned from Duccio. And the larger work was called the Maestà Altarpiece. And Maestà means majesty in Italian. And the central body of this massive work of art, 17 feet left to right. Right? So almost as big as this entire wall. Right? And the central part of this is a reconstruction because it's been split apart. Right? The central body is the Virgin and Child, that same pose we saw with Giotto and the earlier work as well. On her throne, still more realistic, more three-dimensional, comes out in front of her, swoops her on the back, surrounded by angels and saints, all of whom are important to the city of Siena, where Duccio is working. Right? And there are additional scenes around that, on the bottom and on the top. And, as we'll see, on the back. Right? And that's because you can visit the church during off hours, right? If you came for communion, you would see this, and the priest would be in front of it performing the mass. Right? But if you went there, say, Tuesday at 4, you could walk around the back of it as well, just like you would as a tourist today, and see things that you couldn't see during the mass. But during the mass, you saw her in heaven, surrounded by saints and angels. Right? And as we talked about on Monday, this scene in the middle is not meant to tell a story. It's not a narrative scene. It's more just like a portrait, right? There's no sort of before and after. There's no sequence of action that we're seeing a moment of. But the scenes in the bottom and on the top and on the back are narrative scenes, right? And they give us the life of Christ from his infancy through his death and the life of the Virgin Mary, his mother. So down below, we have the infancy of Christ, his childhood. Up above, we have the life of the Virgin Mary. And on the back, we have the adulthood and the death of Christ. Right? 51 different paintings of the life of Christ accompanied that central panel. Right? A lot of detail to be seen. And we've got one of them. Right? So sometime 17th or 18th century, this was split up, sold off by the city. And we were lucky enough to get some of them here eventually. A little sidelight. The NGA only opened to the public around 1940. It's extraordinary. That's late in the game, right? The Metropolitan Museum of Art had been open for almost 100 years in New York, right? Major collections in Europe go back to royal collectors, right? The National Gallery in London comes out of the British thrones collections, right? The Louvre in Paris is the old French royal collection, right? And how we got some of the stuff we got. Extraordinary. We have this from easily Duccio's single most important work. And we've got part of it here. And sometimes we've got that in the 20th century, but it's still available for someone to look at. And when you look through that museum, it's just incredible. The sort of the best, the only, the great example of stuff that we have there. When I interviewed for this job back in, I took an extra day to go to the NGA. I hadn't been to the NGA in a while. I went to grad school in New York, right? And so I'd gone to the NGA when I was living in New York, but that was back in the 80s and 90s. And I hadn't been back in a while, right? So I took an extra day because I was already out here. I was living in Oregon, flew out for the interview. And I took an extra day. I go down there, and I spent sort of the day walking around the National Gallery, refamiliarizing myself with this stuff, because I knew I was going to use it to teach. And I'm going out, and there's this guard. He's still there. We're still talking. And he said, did you have a good time? He goes, you guys have a great collection here. Nixon, boring. He goes, no, you. What do you mean? Your collection. This is the National Gallery. This is paid for by your taxes. This is why it's closed right now, right? And it's a wonderful thing to think about, that this is the nation's collection, right? This belongs to us. And when you come April 15th and you're paying your taxes, you know what? Part of it's keeping that museum hopefully open, right? And part of your taxes and pennies are going to pay for the fact that this is free, right? This museum is open to the public for free. One of the great things about living in DC, and nobody goes. Go to a museum in New York and it's crowded. You're looking over people's heads to see things. And people come to DC and they want to go see, the Constitution, the ruby slippers in the American History Museum. They don't want to go see art, and so we get down there and we sit in this room full of Giotto and Duccio, and you're by yourself. Right? Great, they're ours. Okay. Back to the picture at hand. The painting that we see here came from this row of paintings at the bottom, and the term we use for that is a predella, as we identify the parts of this altarpiece. It's a complex of different paintings. They're all on wooden panels, and they're all using the same media that we talked about before. So egg tempera paint, right? That's the pigment, the dry materials ground up and mixed into egg yolk. Dries hard, dries opaque, dries fast. On a wooden panel, usually oak, and gold leaf in the background. Very thinly hammered gold. The way you get the gold leaf to stick to the surface is you put down, and you can see some of it coming through, a very thin layer of clay, and you rub it, polish it from the back of a spoon, and that gives it static electricity, and the gold just sticks. And you can see some of it's called bowl, B-O-W-L, by the angel's heads up there. That helps the gold leaf to stick. And the crack you see is something you expect to see. Because over the years, humidity changes, temperature changes have made the living surface of the painting sort of warp and change. And that causes that crack pattern, which is a great thing to see because you know it's not fake. Right? Okay, so this was one of a number of scenes of the infancy of Christ on the front of this altarpiece in the predella, right? I've got a close-up coming up of the main altar itself, right? There's the main scene in the middle, and again, I don't have a good picture of this. The Virgin and Child surrounded by saints and angels, just like Giotto had painted, in that newer, more realistic style. As I mentioned, it's absolutely huge. This is only about half as big across as it really is. The commission went to Duccio in 1308, and we know from the city records that he was done in 1311. So that's how we have the dates, right? It's not dated itself. And the contract says that Duccio is supposed to paint everything. Don't use any shop assistants, right? Because they want it to be the best work you can possibly do. Now we know he kind of skirted that we have one from the back and we think it's by shop assistants, right? How he skirted that, I don't know. But the contract says, right? And it's a very important work for this reason. The patron saint of Siena is the Virgin Mary. Right? So that means even though most altarpieces showed the Virgin and Child on a heavenly throne like this one did, this had particular importance for the city because she is their protector. Right? She is the one to whom they turn in times of trouble, rather than another intermediary. I looked it up. Arlington's patron saint, does anybody know? St. Thomas More, English Reformation era, beheaded by Henry VIII. Right? He's our patron saint. He's one of the windows in the chapel. Is Thomas More. Right? Every city sort of has a patron saint. So she was the patron saint of Siena, and that meant that this altarpiece had particular resonance for the people of Siena. And in fact, on the front of her throne, you see that red inlay that's on the step of the throne at the bottom, has an inscription in it. And it basically, it's a prayer to the Virgin Mary from Duccio. It said, Dear Virgin Mary, please, through this altarpiece, please show your grace to the city of Siena. And it says, also show your grace to Duccio, who painted you so nicely. Right? So that's part of it. He's doing it as a prayer. Right? So we think of artists doing works for self-glory, and part of the inscription kind of gets to that. But really, the artist is also doing the work because he sees it as a devotional act. Right? Now, not only was it important to Duccio, But the work of art was also important to the people of Siena. And the day that it was done, we have this in the city records, right? They closed all of the businesses. They had a holiday, right? They closed all of the businesses in town, and everybody assembled at Duccio Studio. All of the heads of the city magistrate, right? All of the heads of the local trade guilds, all of the priests of each of the parish churches in town, right? And all of the people assembled behind them. They all came to Duccio Studio as they were taking the painting out and carrying it through the city. Again, 17 feet apart, right? And they're moving it from Duccio Studio to be installed on the high altar in the cathedral of Siena, right? And all of the bells in town were ringing, and they had hundreds and hundreds of torches blazing, right? Trumpets blaring, as this image is walked through the city and placed on the altar. Right? And that's again the importance. That idea of walking it through the city was part of the protection of the city. Right? So it's an extraordinarily important picture, right? In the history of Siena, in early Renaissance art. And we're lucky enough to have part of the predella from the bottom of it, right? Close up of her, I guess we don't want to look at that. Pudgy little Jesus, though, he's kind of cute in this way. Almost looks like a ventriloquist doll, the way the lines on the sides of his mouth work. And baby Jesuses tend to have male pattern baldness. In this time, they tend to look like little adults often. And some people think they didn't have access to children models. Other people think that it might be theological, that Jesus, a way of showing that Jesus is fully mature spiritually at his birth, right? There's no way to tell because nobody sat down and wrote about it. I love how the angels are like leaning over the side of the kind of resting. It's like watching the Virgin Mary as they're worshiping her on the sides of that throne, and how the liveliness, right? They're looking at each other, they're engaging with each other. Here, right, leaning there and kind of talking to the person next to them. That increase in realism is a hallmark of this early 14th century painting. Right? Again, like I said, painted on the back as well, right? So there's more of these 51 different scenes. Some of them are lost forever, right? Some of them were trimmed down, and the museum that has them only has part of it, right? But we can tell where they originally go from various descriptions, including someone like Lizardo. Right? So we're very fortunate. We have part of the back as well. This is also in the National Gallery. We think this one is by pupils because the style is not as refined as the Nativity on the front. Right? So here's the Nativity. Nativity is just from the Latin word for birth. And the image of the Nativity doesn't show the birth of Christ, right? We always call them the birth of Christ, but it's not like he's crowning, you know? It's not the birth of Christ. It's moments after the birth of Christ, if you will, right? And invariably, it's very traditional what we see. So we see the Virgin with Jesus. Jesus lays in this manger, right? In a barn, if you will. The barn is now set kind of into a cave. And we have an ox and a donkey. And they're always there, looking down. Because he's laying where they're supposed to eat, right? And that's kind of interesting because, you know, in Catholic theology, right, Christian theology, the communion that you eat at the altar that was in front of this picture, you eat Jesus. This is the body of Christ, the priest tells him. That is broken for you, and you eat that. And here's the ox and the ass. They're looking down at Jesus where they're supposed to eat. There's a connection there. Theologians said that the donkey and the ox also represented all of the world. That an ox follows directions, and he represented Christianity, the people who heard the message and obeyed. Donkeys don't do what they're told. They're stubborn. And this anti-Semitic medieval theology said that's the Jews. They heard the message too. They didn't recognize the Messiah. They behaved like a donkey, kicked against their master. Right? But they're always there. And they carry this symbolism, right? We'll end with this. I wanted to show you an earlier image of the Nativity to give you a sense of how subject matter was, the layout of the picture. That Duccio is taking the iconography that had been established as a visual standard, and he's simply updating the style. So in the same thing, right? This is in the kind of a half dome corner of a Greek church, right? And we can see the same thing. So we've got the figures with the basin there, put them in the foreground. Christ on the manger with the ox and the donkey here. Angels on either side. Inside this kind of cave, right? We've got these figures on the right, right? We've got the old man on the left. The same figures in the same places everywhere we look. It's incredibly conventional, right? In the subject matter. But what Duccio has done is to upgrade the style to something more realistic. His hill looks kind of like a hill rather than just a bunch of horizontal lines on the sides. And the figures have a greater sense of three-dimensionality, modeling of, what was that $10 word we used? Chiaroscuro in the Monday lecture, right? Three-dimensional model. Okay? Now we'll dive deeper into Duccio, talk more about the subject matter. God, in a week. I'm going to see you guys again in a week, right? And we'll move on from there, right, into the 14th century, deeper 14th century, 15th century, and move forward. So you've got a worksheet that covers some of this material. It's all on Giotto. That's due on Monday. And for next Thursday, there's one that's on the sort of next section that we'll be getting to. Okay? So you got those things coming up, right? If you have any questions on anything, email me, drop by my office. Obviously not on Monday. And I'll be happy to sort of discuss these things with you, right? Those of you who did not do, if you came in late and you're one of these, if you did not do the makeup assignment for Monday, you need to get that to me today, right? Otherwise, you'll simply be counted as an unexcused absence for that day, right? That's not an option. That's a mandate from upstairs. Okay, I'll see you guys in a week.